Made in Tallaght, an investigation of the origins of the early medieval Irish manuscript known as the Stowe Missal. Imagine, if you will, that some document of yours were to survive into the 33rd century. Not any particularly significant document, mind you, perhaps simply a file about some procedure at work or some school or university guidelines to which you have added a note or two. Something simple. What significance would such a document have in the distant 33rd century? It is, of course, hard to say. Much will probably depend on how many similar documents happen to survive for 12 centuries. Some interest may also derive from your own person, as well as the place in which said document was written. Circumstance may add further meaning. Even basic procedures relating to the present pandemic may at some further remove prove significant. Finally, the very language in which your document is written may become an object of study, a witness to what is by then almost certainly an equally ancient and dead variety of speech. The point of this brief exercise is to illustrate that even the most mundane of things may in time become extraordinary. Something of the sort must have happened to the topic of our present investigation, the early Irish manuscript known as the Stowe Missal. The Stowe Missal was written about 1200 years ago, in the first half of the 9th century AD, by a scribe whose name is unfortunately lost to time. The manuscript's main claim to fame is that it is one of the oldest surviving documents of the early Irish Church, and that it offers unique insight into the nature of the early Irish liturgy. In other words, it tells us something of the way in which Mass was said in early medieval Ireland. In spite of this, in a physical sense, the Stowe Missal may accurately be described as a small and rather bland manuscript. Measuring only 14 by 11 centimeters, it is no larger than a modern pocketbook, except that it is somewhat thicker than most. For unlike modern books, the Stowe Missal was not written on paper, but on relatively thick vellum, that is to say, parchment made of calfskin. Even apart from its small size, the Stowe Missal is a remarkably unspectacular manuscript, being almost entirely devoid of decoration. Whereas some of the surviving early Irish manuscripts, such as the famous Book of Kells, are richly ornamented and were clearly designed to dazzle the eye, our little manuscript must have been made with a different aim in mind. Although we may not know quite who made the Stowe Missal, its purpose is nevertheless clear. The manuscript's size offers us one clue, for like any good pocketbook, the Stowe Missal is eminently portable. Moreover, the very sparseness of its decorations suggests that it was inexpensively made and was intended for practical use rather than for display. This was not a high-status document. The manuscript's contents offer a further clue. As befits its name, the majority of the Stowe Missal is concerned with the ordinary and canon of the Sunday Mass, as well as orders for 3 special votive masses. Following this liturgical core, the manuscript continues with the order of baptism and the visitation of the sick, including communion and last rites. Finally, the Stowe Missal contains an incomplete copy of the Gospel of John, a brief theological tract on the meaning of the symbols of the Mass, and 3 medicinal charms. Only the tract and the 3 charms are in the Irish language, all other texts being in Latin. This somewhat curious mix of texts happens to constitute just about the bare minimum of what an early medieval priest would have needed to perform his pastoral duties if access to other books were restricted. This can hardly be a coincidence. Taken together, the evidence thus points to the Stowe Missal having been intended for the humble use of a priest, most likely one serving a wide-ranging rural community rather than any single monastic centre, where the presence of a library would almost certainly have provided access to various supplementary sources, such as a full gospel book. Indeed, the wording of various prayers found in the Stowe Missal, in which specific mention is made of our brothers on the road and the success of our journey, gives credence to the idea that this was the handbook of an itinerant or travelling priest. As chance would have it, we may actually be able to identify the priest for whom the Stowe Missal was intended. For this we must first turn to the 3 Irish charms mentioned in passing before. These medicinal charms were intended to cure an ailment of the eye, injury by a thorn, and an unspecified urinary disease. Although Christian in nature, charms such as these are not commonly found in liturgical documents. Together with the fact that they are here found on the very last page, it seems likely that they were not copied into the manuscript along with the remainder of the text when the Stowe Missal was first being written. Rather, they were probably added at some later date. The script of these charms has unflatteringly been described as rough and differs slightly from charm to charm. In the past, it has generally been supposed that they were added by 3 separate scribes. However, a close study of the script reveals that they all share a number of rare features. The most notable of these are the general angularity of the script, as opposed to the more usual marked roundness of insular Irish script, as well as the almost uniform use of the capital uppercase form of the letter R as opposed to its lowercase minuscule counterpart. The only real differences between the script of the 3 charms consists of variation in the thickness of the strokes, the spacing of the lines, and the size of the letters themselves. In a very real sense, however, these relatively minor discrepancies need be no more significant than the differences we might observe in our own handwriting from one occasion to the next, and it is reasonable to conclude that all 3 charms were the work of a single scribe. For although the size of one script may differ at times, the basic shapes of the letters themselves tend to be more or less consistent, and this is what we find here. Additionally, the aforementioned variation in the thickness of the strokes may hold some further significance, for this may well reflect a peculiarity of the medieval writing instrument of choice, the goose feather quill. Unlike modern pens, a quill required regular trimming in order to keep a sharp edge. Even slight variation in the way one cut one's pen would result in notably sharper or fatter strokes. The fact that this page displays such a clear difference in the thickness of its strokes, in which the lettering of the first charm is so much fatter than that of the final 2, almost certainly implies that the scribe used differently cut quills to add these charms. Together with the inconsistencies in the spacing of the lines, which are most apparent between the 2nd and 3rd charms, it seems reasonable to conclude that these 3 charms were added on different occasions over an extended period of time rather than all at once. In turn, this implies that whoever added them must have had access to the Stowe Missal for a good long while and was therefore most likely the owner of the manuscript. Given the intended purpose of the manuscript, this in turn implies that he himself was a travelling priest. As it turns out, the features of the script which allow us to conclude that the charms were actually the work of a single scribe, namely marked angularity and the use of the capital letter R instead of its lowercase counterpart, as well as a fair number of more subtle traits, are actually found throughout much of the Stowe Missal. They are especially prominent in the Irish language theological tract on the symbols of the Mass, the pages of which even share a similar basic layout to that of the charms. The tract is of linguistic interest for being one of the earliest surviving examples of a relatively long, continuous text in the Irish language. By contrast, most other surviving early manuscript witnesses to the Irish language tend to consist only of short notes and phrases, called glosses, on Latin main texts. For our present purposes, however, the main significance of the Stowe Missal tract is that its script shows that it is almost certainly added by the same scribe who wrote the charms. Unlike the charms, the tract has clear liturgical significance and is closely connected in terms of its contents with the remainder of the manuscript, demonstrating that our scribe was not just interested in charms, but was very much engaged with the main business of the Stowe Missal as well. A more difficult question is raised by the script of the Latin core of the Missal, for although much of the text again features marked angularity and the use of capital R, the script and layout differ quite strongly from that of the tract and the charms. Here, in the Latin text of the Sunday Mass and also in the order of baptism, the script is neat, regular, and more obviously still, large. The layout differs in that there are far fewer lines to a page. Yet even here, a close study reveals that the fundamental shape of the letters is in fact remarkably similar to that found in the more careless and informal way in the Irish tract and the charms. The similarities are especially close between the enlarged initial letters, which are sometimes found at the beginning of a line, serving to indicate a major break in the text, such as the beginning of a new paragraph, or in the case of the charms, a new charm. The shape of these big script letters is almost identical across most of the Stowe Missal, and it is hard to avoid the conclusion that most of the manuscript was in fact written by a single scribe, who generally wrote in a formal big hand and sometimes used a smaller, ruder script. The two styles are, however, never mixed on any single page, and the choice for either the one or the other does not appear to have been random, but rather seems to have depended on the nature of the text our scribe was copying. Formal big script coincides with, for example, the instructions for the Mass and the sacraments. These texts were read from the book during the actual performance of these holy rituals, and are therefore notable for having to be clearly legible even from some distance. Do remember, the Stowe Missal is a very small book. Mind you, Mass was offered in Latin, although the audience would almost certainly not have been altogether familiar with that language. Large and formal script is costly, both because it takes a relatively long time to write, and also because the large size of the script itself means that more pages are needed to fit the text. It should therefore not be much of a surprise that in a purely functional, workmanlike manuscript like the Stowe Missal, such formal script was reserved solely for text which absolutely needed it. Given that the tract was almost certainly intended for private reflection, and that, although the charms were probably chanted in the presence of someone who was ill, the setting would certainly have been less public than that of, say, the Sunday Mass, it makes good sense that our scribe saved himself both time and precious parchment by switching to a smaller, ruder script for these latter parts of the manuscript. Having thus discovered that the majority of the Stowe Missal was written by a single scribe, and that this scribe seems to have added the 3 charms over an extended period of time, we may thus reasonably conclude that the scribe who copied most of the manuscript was himself the original owner and intended user of the Stowe Missal. And as the manuscript was clearly intended for the use of a travelling priest, our scribe must have been such a priest, serving a rural community. At this stage, we may wish to ask where his community might have been located, way back in the early 9th century. For this we turn to one of the litanies, that is, a form of prayer consisting of a usually repetitive series of petitions found in the Stowe Missal. In this particular litany, in which a good number of saints are asked to look kindly upon the petitioner and his community, mention is made of Saint Maelruin, the founder of the monastery of Tallaght in South County Dublin, who died on the 7th of July in the year 792 AD. Maelruin is rather a prominent saint, for he was one of the leading figures of the Tallaght or Chaldee movement, which sought to reform the early Irish Church. The Tallaght, the name itself simply means the servants of God, were well known for being strictly ascetic, denying themselves most material comforts, for example by refusing to drink beer, and engaging in regular extensive bouts of prayer, reciting vast portions of scripture on a daily basis. In and of itself, the mention of a well-known saint such as Maelruin would not be very significant for localizing a manuscript, but in this case something special is going on. First of all, Maelruin, who had only been dead for a very short time when our manuscript was written, is the only recent saint to have been added to what is otherwise a list of much earlier saints. Indeed, all other saints in this litany predate him by at least a century. My ruin must therefore have been given the singular honour of consciously being added to an existing older list within the first few years or at most decades after his death. In addition, my ruin was also given the rare honour of having his name written with a capital letter. This may not seem all that important to a modern reader, used as we are to the convention of writing personal names with a capital letter, but this was done only rarely in most medieval manuscripts. In this particular litany, only a handful of saints are marked out by the use of a capital letter, and my ruin finds himself in the high company of, for example, Saints Peter and Patrick themselves. Although Mael Ruin was a prominent saint, it is reasonable to assume that there would be no other place in the entirety of Ireland where he would have been more honoured than in his own foundation, the monastery of Tallaght. For this reason, it has long been assumed that the Stowe Missal was made in Tallaght, and it follows that our travelling priest would have been active somewhere in the surrounding area. However, over the past few decades, a number of scholars have embraced a contrary hypothesis, which holds that the Stowe Missal was not made in Tallaght after all, but should rather be considered the product of the monastery of Lorra, County Tipperary. Their main argument is founded on the fact that the Stowe Missal was kept in Lorra for much of the later medieval period. This is established not so much from the manuscript itself, which is silent on such matters, but instead comes from the shrine in which the Stowe Missal was stored from the 11th century onwards. This shrine, which in Irish is called a cúftach, and which is nowadays exhibited in the National Museum of Ireland, was made especially for the Stowe Missal, but is almost totally unlike the manuscript it was designed to contain. Unlike the Stowe Missal, the richly made shrine of silver and bronze was very much intended to catch the eye, and must have been a treasured possession of its church. Inscriptions on the older face of the shrine allow us to confidently conclude that it was made for the abbot of the monastery of Lorra sometime between the years 1027 and 1033 AD. This dating is based on the personal histories of the three kings who are mentioned on the shrine: Donogh, son of the famous High King Brian Boru, Magrath o Donogh, and Fiend o Dungholich, king of the Muscreya. The latter's death in 1033 AD allows us to assign the making of the shrine to before that year, because only living persons are usually commemorated in this way. The presence of the other two, Donogh and Magrath, is somewhat more complicated, for they are both here given titles which they did not actually hold at that time. Donogh, like his father, is called Ji Herent, or High King of Ireland, a title to which he certainly aspired, but which remained disputed throughout his life. Magrath is here called King of Cashel, a title to which he was little more than a pretender until about the year 1045, when Carthach, the recognized King of Cashel and Magrath's first cousin, was burned to death. Curiously then, both Donogh and Magrath are referred to by the titles they claimed rather than the ones they held. The two also happen to be rivals, figuring prominently in a struggle for power over Lower Ormond, the very region in which Lorra was located. It would seem that by honouring the both of them, the abbot of Lorra attempted to keep his monastery out of their frequent wars. Unfortunately for the abbot, his policy would eventually fail, for he himself was slain but a few years later, in the year 1037 AD, along with the new king of the Muscreya, who had sought shelter in his church at Lorra. Fortunately for us, the abbot's decision to enshrine the Stowe Missal did cause the manuscript to be carefully preserved as a holy relic, allowing what was originally a purely functional everyday manuscript to survive long beyond the time at which it must have lost all practical use and into the present. Returning to our investigation, those scholars who favour a Lorra over a Tallaght origin for the Stowe Missal essentially argue that St Maelruin's prominence was such that he could have been honoured anywhere in Ireland, even so shortly after his death, and that a Tallaght origin is therefore unproven. Given the lack of any further clear manuscript internal arguments for localising the Stowe Missal, they prefer assigning its origins to the monastery in which it certainly was housed from the 11th century onwards, that is to say, to Lorra. Although this is in itself a reasonable hypothesis, it should be noted that it is an argument from silence, based on the absence of evidence, rather than on any positive evidence as to where the manuscript was written some 300 years before its shrine was made. Unfortunately for the proponents of a Lorra origin, the manuscript throws up some further complications, which render this hypothesis untenable. First of all, there is the matter of the litany, in which, as we have seen, St Maelruin was specially honoured. Apart from Maelruin, who is later, all Irish saints mentioned in this list passed away sometime between the 5th and mid-7th century. Coincidentally, this just so happens to be the very period in which the founding saint of Lorra, St Ruadhán, died, for his death is recorded as having occurred on April 15th, 548 AD. It goes without saying that Ruadhán would have been especially honoured in his own monastery, and yet he is conspicuously absent in this litany. It seems highly unlikely that the scribe writing in Lorra would have failed to record that monastery's very own St Ruadhán, while actively altering an old litany to include the recently deceased Maelruin of Tallaght. A further complication arises in the person of Moel-Cach, whom we have not mentioned before. Moel-Cach was what we call an interpolator, that is to say, a scribe who, some time after the original copying of the manuscript, replaced parts of the original text and even added a number of new pages to the manuscript. Apart from adding a new introductory prayer to the order of baptism, Moel-Cach's work was restricted to the text of the Mass, to which he made quite considerable alterations. This raises a rather important question. Why did he alter the text? The easiest solution is that Moel-Cach sought to tailor the Stowe Missal's ordinary of the Mass to suit the specific liturgical needs of his community, and that whatever had originally been in the Stowe Missal simply did not do. Back in the early medieval period, Ireland did not have a uniform liturgy, and regional variation was the norm. If Moel-Cach was a priest serving a different community, located in a different part of the island than that for which the Stowe Missal was originally intended, it would be quite reasonable to assume that the local liturgy differed somewhat from that originally recorded in the manuscript. And it would make perfect sense for Moel-Cach to want to make some changes in order to allow him to use the manuscript for offering Mass at his own church. One of the new texts added by Moel-Cach was a second litany, featuring another, somewhat shorter list of saints. It was clearly again an older list, copied from some earlier source, for all the saints on it had been dead for well over a century when Moel-Cach added it to the Stowe Missal, presumably sometime in the second half of the 9th century AD. This time, Maelruin of Tallaght is not mentioned, but notably St Ruadhán of Lorra is. Indeed, more than a few of the saints in Moel-Cach's litany are from the Midlands. Turning back briefly to the litany in the hand of the original scribe of the Stowe Missal, we made note that his saints actually had a slight Leinster bias. Given that litanies often tended to feature a good few local saints, which would have been especially familiar to the community, this means that Moel-Cach's litany would have been well suited to the needs of a church roughly in the Midlands of Ireland, whereas the original litany would have suited a church in Leinster, especially one that favoured St Maelruin. In other words, The Stowe Missal's original litany accords well with the Tallaght origin, whereas Moyle Carch's alterations fit in with altering the manuscript for use in Laura. That a manuscript might have moved from Tallaght to Laura during the 9th century is in fact not altogether surprising. In general, it is known that monks travelled, and that books were frequently exchanged or at least borrowed for the purpose of making a new copy. More particularly, some other manuscripts must also have been moved from Tallaght to Lower Ormond, the northerly part of Tipperary where Laura is located, within the relevant period of time, for a number of 9th century texts associated with the prominent Celedier monastery of Tallaght ended up in Lower Ormond. Moreover, in the person of Mael Dithruith, who was a pupil of St. Mael Ruin, and who features in a number of Celedier texts himself, we have someone who definitely travelled from Tallaght to Lower Ormond, for Mael Dithruith retired to the monastery of Terryglass, some 7 kilometres away from Laura, after Mael Ruin had passed away. Bringing it all together, there are a number of solid text internal hints, most notably the high honour accorded to St. Mael Ruin in the litany written by the original scribe, as well as the general Leinster bias of the saints recorded therein, which suggests that the Stowe Missal was originally made in Tallaght. The conspicuous absence of Ruadhan, the founding saint of Laura, in this self-same litany makes a Laura origin unlikely. Moreover, the changes made to the manuscript by the later scribe and interpolator Moyle Carch are suggestive of a change of place. More particularly, the saints mentioned in the litany in his hand are well suited to the needs of a church roughly in the Midlands. Knowing that there are other manuscripts which were moved from Tallaght to Lower Ormond in Tipperary in the relevant time period, it is easy to envisage the Stowe Missal, having passed out of the ownership of its original scribe and user, being brought over to from Tallaght to Laura, sometime in the later 9th century. Once in Laura, the Stowe Missal at first remained a purely practical document and was altered by Moyle Carch to suit the local liturgy of that monastery. Nevertheless, after some time, the Stowe Missal went out of active use, and by the early 11th century the abbot of Laura had a shrine made to house the manuscript as a holy relic. The manuscript remained in Laura for the remainder of the medieval period, for it was still there when the shrine was refurbished in the mid-14th century at the behest of Philip O'Kennedy of nearby Lackeen Castle, who died in 1381. The Stowe Missal then disappeared for a few centuries before finally turning up in 1819 in the library of Stowe House, England, the ancestral seat of the Marquess of Buckingham. It was finally returned to Ireland in 1883, when it became part of the collection of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, where it remains to this day. With that, we reach the end of this investigation into the origins of the little manuscript known as the Stowe Missal. Although the limits of time and space have not allowed for a full exposition, and some detail was needs left out, I hope you have enjoyed the ride, sharing, if but for a moment, in the delight of piecing together some of the context in which this relic of Ireland's past must once have existed. Thank you.